Welcome to Thunder in the East. This isn't a game, this is a way of life. It is the initial entry in a rather ambitious epic covering the entire European theater of operations in World War II. Honestly, don't think I recognized that when I first pledged this thing on Kickstarter, whatever it was, a year and a half ago. I just thought it looked really interesting, so I went for it, and then later I kind of found out what I was in for. Now I'm still trying to get my mind around how to actually play this beast, so I think I'll start with just a tour of the components. Everything's big in this game, including the rulebook. And I say rulebook because it is not some little stapled together bunch of sheets. It is a bound book. Very big. 88 full pages. Look at that. The last page, 88, has rule 209. Oh my God, 209 rules? Are you kidding me? Yeah, no, there's not 209 rules. It's divided into sections. The first section is the standard game. And that starts, with rule number 1 and proceeds through with all the basics up until rule 27, I believe. At that point, the optional rules begin. And they begin with rule 100. Just leave plenty of room in the 0 to 100 range for extending the standard rules. Then there's a set of optionals, which of course you'll want to play, but they are marked as optional. And then it concludes with the campaign rules, which begin numbering at 200. Now the standard and the optional really come into play for scenarios, and there are 6 scenarios. And then the campaign ties it all together with these rules. You don't need these rules for playing scenarios, but the standard and the optional will certainly come into play there. This is a dense, complicated game. Big rule book. What I like is that the rules are kind of in the center, and then the margins are given over to some explanations, some graphical presentations of the concepts, some call-outs to emphasize things. There's a lot of use of color and pictures to denote certain aspects that are relevant to standard, optional, or campaign rules. So it's all in here. It's quite a big mix. But even though it's 88 pages, it's still really not that overwhelming. Lots and lots of interesting concepts, but they're laid out in a way that are pretty accessible. I think I realized when I started to read this that really for the past maybe 2 years, I've played a whole lot of games for systems I already knew. This is the first complex system that I've learned in a couple of years. So it's really kind of interesting, for me anyway, to see some of these presentation options and the style of explaining things. It's really presented as if you've never seen a war game before, so it tries to take you through it from its perspective without assuming too much on your part. And one thing that's really very helpful is this reference book. There's actually a little booklet that has many of the concepts laid out, alphabetically, so you can refer to it. During play, I think is the intent, but frankly, I found it really helpful when I'm reading the rules, because there are so many things going on, it's hard to keep track. Forward references, back references. So I find myself coming to this to get a quick explanation of something that I might have covered 5 or 6 pages previously. And the last little booklet here is the scenario book. Now it is a gigantic game. It spans the entirety of the war from 1939 to 1941 to 1945. This whole system will of course cover the entire war from 1939 or even before through 1945. So it's a very dense and complicated system, but it has a number of scenarios as described in this booklet, so you can play it just as an operational game without considering any of the bigger concepts that play into the campaign game. So there are a set of scenarios that cover the full breadth of the German-Soviet war, and you can focus on those as just like operational games. and it kind of helps to pick up many of the concepts without being overwhelmed by the entire campaign, the entire conflict. But this is very colorful. You know, it has specific setups, a number of helpful tips, and all the information you need to play each of the scenarios. So this is in itself a very good resource. I mean, a huge, 40-page scenario book. I'm going to take a bit of a left turn here and look at the things that really drew my attention when I first saw this being presented on Kickstarter. And that is these counters. They're really pretty interesting. I was really intrigued by the variety of shapes and sizes that was presented. Like here, this is a army, so a gigantic major unit, and it's a huge counter. Go down a level to a corps, and it's a smaller counter. Go down even further to divisions and corps groups and things like that, and they get even smaller, sort of a visual representation of the size and the strength of the units. Add to that circular, sort of an arrow, the various shapes. There are even these half moons, which are pretty important little counters, but all the different iconography and shapes and sizes really drew my attention. I just wanted to see what kind of game would be making use of these kinds of components. And there are 13 of these sheets in all. It seems like a huge number of sheets, but actually, when I think about it from the standpoint of a typical, half-inch counter sheet, completely filled, it's really not that much more. And there's a lot of extra space around these counters. So lots of sheets, but really not an overwhelming number of counters. Just going for a bit of a closer look at some of these counters. See the gigantic German armies here. Obviously they're going to be their minor allies. Aircraft counters. Look at some of the iconography on it. It has an 8-ball there that has a specific play effect. Those giant armies can break down into corps, so you have smaller counters representing that. Even economic supply status. These are all two-sided. Here's some more aircraft for the Germans. One thing that's pretty important is this headquarters. The headquarters are key to attacking and also for supply purposes. So there's sort of a front and back to the counter that indicates kind of what mode it's in. Plenty of Soviet counters as well. I like these little odds markers. This allows you have to declare your attacks, so you can use these to indicate the odds of your attacks you're planning. And of course you even get a Stalin counter, since capturing Moscow and the government could be a victory condition. Plenty of these improved counters for basic improved positions and defenses. And on the back they become fortified counters. And there are even some fleet counters, though that's a pretty small aspect of this game. Be much bigger in later entries. There are a bunch of different dice here. Really and truly, these are the only dice in the game. You have 2 dice for combat, and then these are support dice for combat, and they come into play for different battles. These are really tokens or markers. They're supply dice. I shouldn't call them dice, supply tokens, markers. The idea is you can place these on the map to help you understand different aspects of the supply mechanisms while you're playing that phase of the game. And it'll be easy to understand exactly what the effects are because these great big things will be plopped right on the map. And you'll be readily apparent what is going on. But otherwise, you don't throw these dice, you actually place them. There's also a huge deck of cards. Since they span so many years, they're going to be split up by side, by faction, and then by time frame. The idea is that these are kind of event cards. You get to play them. It's not a card-driven game, but it's a card-affected game, I guess I would say. There's quite a few of them. I actually own 2 copies of this game. For some reason, I decided to pledge it twice. Must have forgotten I did it the first time. So I will have one pristine one, and I'll be tearing these open as soon as I get to actually start playing. Now, there are 2 kinds of aids that come with the game. Player aids, there's generally 2 of them, and 1 for each side, are back printed. Actually, I don't understand why these are identical on the front and both sides. But these are, the typical kind of aid you expect to help you understand how to, execute some facet of the game. Morale rules. This is the sequence of play. Look how dense that is. That should tell you how involved it is to play. And also with the coloring, again, it's broken down into standard, optional, and campaign. So it kind of calls it out pretty obviously with the colors. But there's 2 of these, 1 for each side. Terrain effects, of course. Now, this is a game, when I finally get to start talking about rules later, another segment, it tries to encompass just about every aspect of the war, from campaigning to managing your resources. It's very heavy on resource and economics to drive your war machine. So this little chart tells you essentially how to spend your resources. Then, of course, the combat table. There's air and ground. Air is actually a pretty big aspect of this game. Because it's going to be growing over time, there's a naval contingent as well, but it's not as prevalent here in this Thunder in the East game. So those are the player aids. Then there are things that they refer to as mats. And these are things you would place on the table, alongside your map. And you will be placing counters and markers and so on these things to keep track of different aspects of the game. And there's just 1 copy of these. Make it largely, like there's a shared air operations mat. There's this pretty cool looking resource or economic mat, and you essentially keep track of the economic flow of the game with this, and it's shared between both players. There's this massive turn track. I want you to look how dense this thing is. It is essentially weekly turns. Now those shift a little bit based on the time of year. It'll also shift a little bit based on the different theaters. Well, I shouldn't say theaters, just different parts of the European theater, like when they go to the Mediterranean or they go to the West. But basically you're looking at weekly turns per month. So, my goodness, there's a whole lot of turns in this game. This also shows us the weather that is applicable to each season. Again, that's turn track. A mat stays on the board, common to both. This is a casualty mat. This is where you put your lost units. This hardly looks like a casualty mat to me, I mean, I'm used to seeing like a little box and you put, separated by side. But really the point of this is to kind of note the effect of losses. And you share it. Everybody puts their units here that are lost. Not 1 per side. I think that's kind of interesting. Here are a couple of mats. Again, they remain on the board, but they are specific to each side, each faction. And these are for the campaign game, the theater reserves. And that has a special ability for you to keep reserves and then commit them at a point during the sequence of play. And probably the biggest one are the resource tracks. Each side has this. There are resource points, you have your force pool, and then a bunch of information about how to manage your forces of rivals, departures, breakdowns, and build-ups, and things like that. So all these mats are laid down on your table. So you have a fairly significant amount of space you're going to need just for these mats. And I can understand why so many people are playing this on Vassal rather than, well, I mean, I'm sure plenty of people are playing it with the components, but a lot of play on Vassal because, you don't have to have all this table space just for these mats. So that's a lot of components. Almost all of them. Really only one thing left. Clear a little space for the maps. These are really, heavy stock. They don't feel, well, I mean, they're paper, of course, but they feel more of a poster material than paper maps. So they're very heavy. They are not mounted, but I don't like mounted mats myself, so. They're colorful. They cover most of the eastern front, plus some of the northern, a little bit of the western side as well, because they're going to mate with other maps in future releases, future volumes of this whole system. I'm going to take a minute here to lay these things out. We'll see what they look like all together. Big game needs a big map. It's 50 inches by 43 inches of playing area. 4 full maps. Well, 2 full maps, 2 half maps, I guess I would say. 1, 2, 3, and 4. Bit of a chore to get overlapping. Be a lot easier under Plexi. Now there are places here that are actually out of play for this game. And you have things going all the way up to Sweden, that's out of play. Even all the way down to Yugoslavia in the far southwest. That's not in play either. But otherwise it covers everything from East Prussia and Poland all the way to, well, Stalingrad, Moscow. All the places you know and love. And looking a little closer, I do like the graphical presentation they've chosen for some of the terrain features. But you can also see that, railroads are pretty prominent. That will be important for tracing supply and communications. But also there are some economic and supply aspects printed right on the map, just as a reminder of places that are valuable, like major cities. Now that way down south here in the Caucasus Mountains, pretty imposing looking. Also we see some of the naval aspects. These are ports, different sizes, there's different capabilities along the Black Sea there. And of course the vast marshland. Every map has to have this marshland. I like how it's presented, colorful, and pretty obvious. So that's a quick tour of the components of Thunder in the East. Pretty big game. I think it'll probably take me the rest of the summer to really play it and get to know it. So I'll be checking in at least once or twice more as I learn things and start to really get into it.